So I noticed on many occasions when you speak of the African situation, you are quite positive. And so a part that did like stick out to me in the book was in actually right at the very end, the final paragraph in your epilogue. I'd like to read out the quote that you quoted yourself from David Lanz. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. In this world, the optimists have it, not because they are always right, but because they are positive. Even when wrong, they are positive. And that is the way of achievement, correction, improvement, and success. Educated, eyes open optimism pays. Pessimism can only offer the empty consolation of being right. So, as I said earlier, I noticed much of the book, you're very, very positive about the what I will call the African situation. In various chapters, you highlight the fact that we are better off now than we were in the past. You make a note of our positive trends, like our strides towards ameliorating inequality, our GDP growth, how countries like Botswana are growing quickly. You even talk about height, how we're much taller now than we were quite a while ago. All this and more contributes to a generally positive outlook you express in the book on the prospects of Africa doing well. My question is, in a country where social and political instability is extremely high, we hear words like junk status, soaring prices, state capture, load shedding, cop corrupt politicians in the news almost every day, and we also can't ignore the impacts of COVID. How do we maintain this positive outlook on our future? I mean, I'm even tempted to ask, how are you still positive on the prospects of us as a country doing well?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because it is not always easy to remain positive, right? So I think partly the reason I wrote the book was also because I've experienced my students becoming more pessimistic over the last decade. But I think partly that is, I mean, it's super justified, right? South Africa certainly has done pretty bad the last decade. We've now experiencing negative economic growth over, during and before COVID even, and the outlook is not always very optimistic. So I understand that. Then it's also important for me to realize that my students, many of them can't remember, first years can't remember the 2010 FIFA World Cup, right? They were too young to really experience it in any way. And so the South Africa that they've experienced is very different from the South Africa that I experienced, right? So the South Africa when I kind of, entered adulthood was a South Africa with extreme optimism. There were many things we were concerned about, HIV/AIDS, all these kind of things that obviously also were important. But we also had a growth rate of 4%, 5% when I started my job here. We were building an electric car. We had an electric car shown at the 2007 Paris Motor Show, right before Elon Musk had built his first Tesla. And there was so much optimism. I remember actually telling my wife that we should buy a electric car. We should save for it because it's going to the Joule is going to be in production soon. And so there was so much optimism, and then we took a wrong turn, right? We shifted towards a more state-led orientation or approach. We know of, as you mentioned, the corruption, state capture. Yet the rest of the world didn't go that way. So if you actually look at global growth, you see a kind of a strong trend upwards. South Africa is the kind of outlier. There's obviously one or two other outliers as well, but we are the one that is not reflecting the kind of optimistic story of the rest of the globe. And so I thought it's kind of important to firstly tell students that South Africa is not inevitably doomed, right? I'm not saying we will do better. It's this eyes open optimism that you reflected. Our eyes are open. It's not to say that we are missing all the load shedding and the water shedding and all of these kind of things that are happening at the moment. We are very realistic, but it's also not to say that inevitably we're doomed to just have a failed state, right? I think if you go back to the early 1990s, I was too young to experience this, but you can read about this and you realize just the incredible pessimism there is about South Africa, right? So many people, late 1980s, people believe we're going to have a civil war. Education is in a terrible state for most of South Africa's population. There's very high levels of poverty. We've got very high levels of inflation. We've had more than 10% inflation for more than a decade. We've had very high levels of public debt. There's actually no hope for South Africa, right? And then yet, within 10, 15 years, we turn it around with these high growth rates. Our debt comes down. We have low inflation, lower interest rates. So that's a remarkable turnaround. So if we could do it then, there's no reason that we can't do it again, right? That's the point. And the important thing here is, I mean, in a couple of places in the book, I think I mentioned this, is that many of the people who became fabulously rich were people who were willing to take on those risks during times when everyone else was saying, you know, it's too dangerous, I'm quitting, right? And so I think the successful entrepreneurs are those that are willing to take on those risks and succeed. And I think in South Africa, we, of course, we need the private sector, we need the entrepreneurs, we need the investment. We also need, of course, the politicians to do the right thing and get the kind of right policies in place. But I don't think we should think that this will never happen. It's not to say that it will happen, but I think we need to be optimistic and think that they are. If we do the right thing, we can again return to a place where we experience economic growth. And I should add that that economic growth was not just for the rich. This was poverty declined from 37% to 7%, like a massive decline in poverty. And then since then we see actually poverty increase again. So it was just a time when we could see the fruits of our labor. Whereas now, like, we've had a decade, even more than a decade now, where we don't, and that is frustrating. It's obviously worsened by COVID, but the hope must be there that it can turn around.